you everyone for attending this sixth session of Voices for Peace, the series of webinars that we're doing together among a series of organizations. Amongst we have the Climate Youth Resilience, the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation that are our hosts today, Amnesty International, Greenpeace Africa, Roots, the 50%, Sokakaka International. Am I forgetting anyone? I believe I do. Oh, and the Positive Peace Society from Hiroshima University. So thank you so much for joining us today on this great conversation. We're going to be talking today about a conversation on collective healing and remembering our way forward. For that, our hosts today are going to be Nasli Abrams and Shanae Kimpo from the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation. So thank you so much for having us today, for hosting this talk, and we look very much forward to learning a lot from you today. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Matthias, and thank you very much for everybody for being here. I'm very privileged, or I feel really privileged that you took the time this afternoon to join us. So thank you. Matthias did a little bit of an introduction. I'm just going to add a little bit to that and say that until very recently, I had one foot firmly planted in Canada and the other foot firmly planted in South Africa. And until very recently, I made the transition, and now I'm very safely ensconced in South Africa, and it's been an incredible journey so far. So, and this very much is part of that journey. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Chanel to introduce herself, and then we'll get going.
Thank you so much, Nasli, and good day to all. I'm Chanel Kimpo, certainly from Cape Town, always been here my entire life. And it's certainly an honor to meet each and every one of you in this room today. And most importantly, to speak about this conversation right here that's not only calling us to talk about healing, but also to practice it together. Right? And if we're looking at our theme right here, it certainly resonates with all of us, right? Whether it's part of our career choices or our lives, whether it's part of our collective identities, it's certainly looking at the ongoing journey of remembering, of reconciling, and basically of restoring. So before we continue, I think it's really important just to be mindful and set the intention for today's talk. And what I'd like to do is to certainly open the call for reflection. And my question to all would certainly be, what does societal meaning mean to you? So what does societal meaning mean to you? Societal healing, sorry. And I'll give everyone just a few minutes maybe to reflect. I'm not certain, Matthias, if we're opening any chats. So people can certainly feel free to pop it in, or if we can open mics to just reflect. You can certainly give that call, Matthias.
Yes, the chat is open. So if anyone wants to write in the chat box, you're welcome to. Or well, as you mentioned, also anyone can just raise their hands, I guess. If I may propose an answer to that, I believe that we live nowadays in a highly polarized world, when the level of polarization is starting to hurt everyone. So if we are talking about healing, I do believe that something very fundamental for that healing would be walking away from this level of polarization that in many places has reached the level of fanatism.
Good. Awesome. Thank you so much. Is there another point as well? Very good reflection, Matthias.
There's something with your phone, I guess, as if something were hitting on it.
Something scratching, almost like
I think I just moved my piece of paper. Sorry about that. All good now?
Thank you. That is good.
Thank you. So definitely to what you're speaking about, Matthias, we're also understanding healing as not being an event, right? It is certainly a relationship. It is something that we all journey together. And what better way to looking at a journey is to certainly go back to the foundations and looking at landscape, right? And when we're looking at landscape, what we're going to be focusing on is certainly looking at the symbolism of ecology, right? We're looking at the soil, we're looking at the river as the metaphors for our collective healing, right? And collective healing in this regard is certainly the broader terms that we're looking at societal healing. So I'll certainly hand over to Nasli to continue from here.
Thank you. Chanel posed a question, just checking in with everybody on what their thoughts were on societal healing. So I'm also going to pose a question, but I'd like you to hold this question in your hearts, in your hands, in your minds, as we journey through the presentation. And we'll come right back to it at the very end. And this is something that has personally challenged me, certainly when I got to the foundation. And the question the question I've had to ask myself is, where in my life and my work can I move from being a fixer of problems to a participant in wholeness? And so I don't want you to answer the question, but I'd really like you just to hold on to it and to think about it as we go through the presentation. And again, thank you so much for being here. Today, we're going to explore how we heal our communities and our societies, but we begin by acknowledging the fractures in our world. Certainly, it was a starting off point for Matthias, but not only just the fractures, but also the profound potential that we all have for wholeness. And what does it actually look like? So to start with, we are looking at moving from breakdown to breakthrough. And oftentimes we focus entirely on the breakdowns and we look for solutions to the breakdowns. But what are some of our breakthroughs? I also just want to posit here that we don't propose to have all the answers. And certainly we don't propose to have a whole lot of answers at all. But really that this is a journey that sits with each and every one of us. And depending on where we are and what our different contexts are, the breakthrough will look a little different. It will both look different and it will both look the same. And so we'll take it from there. We do see signs of breakdown everywhere in our politics, in our communities, in our relationships with each other, and certainly with our relationships with the earth. And the fracture often stems from unhealed wounds, from trauma, from systems that perpetuate separateness, and again, in keeping with what Matthias was reflecting on earlier. But every society also holds the power for more than, it holds more than just a collection of individuals. The research that we want to share with you was a collective piece of research. And it was not just about analyzing breakdowns. It was also looking at actively working through breakthroughs. And the big question was, how do we move away from I and how do we move towards we, but in a very authentic kind of way, and not just as a performance. I want to just talk a little bit about how the research came about. Chanel and I were not the researchers. We have the privilege of presenting the results of the research. And it was a collective that began this work when they came to the crucial realization that we had to let go of this idea that as a collective, we had all the answers. And so rather than looking at the research, rather than doing the research from a point of we're trying to learn and understand healing, what they did was the research through healing. So for each and every one of the persons in the collective, it was about uncovering the research through a healing process. So every conversation, every workshop, every commiseration, it was about the collective experiences that they then drew together. And so one of the underlying foundations is to truly serve collective healing, we can't approach it from the point of view as fixers, that we have to look at it slightly differently. And so what they embarked on was a piece of participatory action research. And again, they entered into this research not as experts, but as co-creators and as co-learners, and certainly as practitioners who are working on the front lines and as real experts in their own contexts. And so they built this knowledge side by side, and they built this knowledge together. And it's a flip on the traditional ways in which we think of knowledge, which usually is sort of top down. And so the principle, again, wasn't just about research about healing, but how do we do research through healing? And the goal was to create a container where healing could occur in the moment. And the insights from the framework, and the insights from that is what you will see in the framework that we share with you today. And it emerged from that shared experience. So what we have is not a final, finished, polished product, but we do believe that it's a roadmap, and it's a breathing, living roadmap that will live and breathe differently with each person who's holding the roadmap, and also each person who's walking the path. So you might add your own thread to it. And so we think of this research as an ever-evolving tapestry. Chanel.
Thanks, Nasli. And just to go back to what Matthias spoke about, right? So when asking the question of what does societal healing means, clearly looking at what it is responding to, right? And if we're looking at a polarized world, ongoing inequities, you name it, the question then becomes, where was the first point of disconnect, right? And the first point of disconnect was certainly from that of nature. So looking at the framework then of this research, we certainly see the ecosystem then becoming the metaphor of how healing then takes place, right? So as you can see on the slide right here, we're certainly looking at the research framework. But just to go a little bit deeper, we are needing to unpack the different elements then of what we see the ecosystem to be, right? And for example, looking at this emergent framework for societal healing, we see also the soil, and the soil also being the container of memory, of safety, and of truth. We also see the roots certainly linked to our identity, our quest and ongoing quest, basically for belonging, and also for that of visibility to be seen, right? We also see then the shoots and being certainly that of courage, being that of voice, being that of storytelling. We are all keepers of knowledge and wisdom, right? We also then see the flow of the river basically being the movement of that transformation that we envision, and also looking at the call to empathy, looking at the call to release for healing to take place, right? And lastly, where the river meets the sea, we certainly see then the fruits of transformation, of justice, and reconciliation. So definitely not only looking at it from a research aspect, but certainly the symbolism and the metaphors to reconnecting to that of nature becomes important for societal healing to take place. Next slide, please, Naz. Thank you so much. And we're going to be looking at two main components of that ecosystem, one being the soil and the second being the river. And what's really important for us to know is the soil certainly provides then the conditions and context for healing itself. So for example, the soil right here, it basically grounds us. It is where we find the nutrients that hold our collective memory, right? And both being fertile, both being painful parts as well of memory. And when we see and speak about soil, the soil certainly, it represents that of memory itself, that of belonging, safety, and grounding, as mentioned. And looking at memory in this context, we're certainly speaking more about a moral groundwork, right? And looking at that of resisting erasure, whether it's for example, that of colonial past or apartheid past, for example, in South African context, right? And looking at what is the post-apartheid or the post-conflict ways to restoring dignity, right, to that memories. It's also important to note that it speaks to that of truth being beneath that denialism, right? So truth being an act of love, and love being also revolutionary in its sense. So certainly looking at how do we look at truth-telling as an act of love and as an act that basically prevents such erasure and erosion, right? Very important also, as mentioned, the soil becomes our foundation of safety, right? So looking at how do we then become spaces that creates safe spaces for others to bring their full selves, right? So coming and returning back to the soil is asking you to strip away of everything, and it's a call to the true self, right? And for example, if we're looking at sites of memory, so for example, in Cape Town, we have the Castle of Good Hope, and it was established built in the 1600s. It still to this day is a reminder of a site of historical trauma. So for example, descendants of both colonized, enslaved, and those who are oppressed by apartheid, they still see the site as a site of trauma, right? And when navigating the space of memory, it's also navigated not only going back to that woundedness of the past, but also looking at what's the prospects then for that transformations that could potentially be there, right? So certainly exploring memory then becomes not only as a spatial experience, but also looking at the quest for ongoing justice and ongoing healing work. So very important to note that the soil certainly remembers even when we don't, right? So the soil certainly being tended to, especially when looking at memory, we certainly then need then that flow of the river for the movement of healing to take place. So looking at the next slide, we certainly will look at how the soil and the river certainly is a need for both, right? There is a need for both. So next slide, please, Natalie. Thank you. When looking at the river again as a metaphor, we also see the river bringing that of healing, it's bringing that of flow, it's bringing that of transformation. And for me personally, I've come to realize that healing is certainly, it's not a destination, right? It's a current. It's a current that is something that needs everyone to move together, right? And therefore, for example, the way in which we move together is to certainly be present and to participate. So no matter how difficult the conversation, the presence and the participation becomes important, because in this metaphor of using the river, we see how the river teaches us that healing is a movement, it's not the arrival. We see how flow happens through that of courage and compassion, bringing it back to the foundations of empathy, right, and connectedness. And we also see transformation then that requires then a release, right? And when also looking at healing in this regard, we certainly see it as not being individualistic. It's certainly a collective practice. So for example, when we heal in relation and not in isolation. When we look at spaces of trauma, we can see it as sanctuaries basically of reflection. The landscapes of reflections are all around us, right? And that's important for us then to immerse ourselves fully, to become fully present. And that right there in and of itself is the medicine for healing to take place. Okay, and there's just one more point I just wanted to also reflect on, as mentioned, about the Castle of Good Hope as a site of historical trauma. One of my observations, for example, was when many descendants stepped into the space, they often stepped and entered with grief, anger, and reverence as well. So looking at all these different emotions, it is important for us to welcome in each and every one of it, right? And the act of return then certainly becomes then the true reclaiming of the self. And that right there becomes a true process of healing. So healing not only as individual, but certainly healing as a collective act. Okay, over to you, Nasli.
Chanel spoke quite a bit about memory and remembering, and she also touched on history. So I'd like to zoom into a crucial phase of remembering. And when we think about remembering, this is the work of putting together, putting back the pieces of our shared humanity. And oftentimes this happens through storytelling, but not just any story, stories that reconnect us. And so I'd like to offer you a very simple practice, or simple, profound practice that can be used anywhere. I'd like us to take a moment and to try this with me. If you can close your eyes for a little bit, I'm going to ask you to think of your name. Just think of your name. What is the story of your name? Who gave it to you? What does it mean? What hopes or histories does your name carry? You don't need to share this. Just feel the story, feel the identity, and feel the humanity that lives right there in your name. You can open your eyes. Notice how the simple question connects you to your history, to your lineage, to your identity, and this tiny act of remembering. So when we do this with others, we move away from othering to including. And when we think about this piece of research, what the research was also saying is that consciousness evolves from I am this and I am that. It doesn't evolve from I am this and not that. So it's a simple flip, this idea of I am this and I am that. And when we invite others into storytelling, or a simple act like just thinking about our names or getting to know each other through the simple act of storytelling, it is a case of, again, recognizing that we are all of it. We are not just pieces of it, but we are all of it. And so we find our stories, our collective stories, in each other and in one another. This is also where we look at internalized patterns that we carry, the voices of individualism, the voices of consumerism, and we begin to hospice them with the same curiosity. And so we try to let them die, and we try to let other practices emerge. I just want to look at this idea of restoring. After the deep work of remembering, we often need refuge. Refuge becomes important. This is it's not about giving up, but it's about taking a sacred pause. Remembering can be really hard work. And so after the hard work, we need to take a break. It's a liminal space where we stop and we stop trying to fix things with old logic. But it's really just, how do we simply feel? How do we listen together? And again, how do we put to bed old practices and make space for new practices? And this is where many of us get stuck. Our inner fixer, I think, is sometimes terrified of this space where we need to reimagine. It might show up as cynicism, a belief that nothing can truly change. But what if that cynicism was just a story that we bought into? A story that protects us from our own vulnerability, a story that protects us from the possibility of hope. And so refuge is about the courage to put the old story down, to stop, and to be present with whatever it is that is with us. And I use this idea of cynicism because that was certainly a challenge for me. I often think of myself as a person who's very cynical, but it's not so much that I'm cynical. I'm having to stop and ask myself, is this something that I've started living because it's something I keep telling myself? What are some of the other things I can tell myself? And those other things that I can start living and being and embracing. And so from that fertile place of not knowing, new seeds begin to sprout. And if I let go of the old story and think of what other stories there are that I can live, it's about restoring my own narrative. And it's not just about restoring, it's about restoring as well. And so we can do this through art, through ritual, through the embodiment of all of it. So it's not just about thinking of a new story, but again, it's about the embodiment of that story. How do we live these new stories? And from there, we can regenerate. So it's about remembering, and it's about restoring, and then it's about regenerating. And regenerating is about the practical work of rebuilding new structures, structures that are rooted in relational practice or relationality, in reciprocity, where power is exercised with wisdom and with compassion. And compassion is such a critical word in our world right now, just given all of the fractures, or the nature of the fractures and the polarization. So I don't know about everybody else in the room, but I do know that my inner fixer often dresses up as cynicism. It says, why bother? It won't work. And so my refuge is about having the courage to notice that voice and then gently say, I see it, I hear it, and I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to allow that voice to be quiet and see what else I can take up. And not just take up, but what else I can embody and what else I can live through. And so what does this mean for us? You might be thinking, well, who are the healers? Who does the collective healing? And the healers are all of us in our stories, in our beings, in our lives, our histories, our lived experiences. And so for all of us, we are all the healers. And it's about how we take that challenge up. And I say this about taking up the challenge just from a personal point of view. When I first came to the foundation, one of the things that I heard a lot was this idea of hope, of radical hope. And that it's not just about hope, but it's the courage to hope. That it's easy to be angry, it's easy to give up, it's easy to keep doing things in the same way. And so when we think about what does this mean as a practitioner, it's about the hard work of hope. It's also about the hard work of rethinking ways of being. And so letting go of ego gently, trusting the process, but also trusting each other, being okay with uncertainty, being okay with discomfort, letting go, but also just being. And the core question, sorry, I'm not sure what I just did. The core question is, can I love? And so for a lot of us, we go into spaces, we don't like to be vulnerable because we don't like to ask, does love exist in this place? Can I love? And can I be love? But more importantly, can I accept the love that comes my way? And so in all of that, if I think of all of this research, it's a tapestry of a whole bunch of different love stories, whether it's about restoring, remembering, re-emerging, regenerating, repurposing. In all of those different trajectories, it's about, can love exist here? Now I'm going to shift gears slightly and come back to this question. In the very beginning, we asked the question about where in life and work can we move from being fixers of problems to participants in wholeness? And so this is a question I'd like to leave us with and open up the discussion and ask, what are some of the ways in which we can do this? Perhaps it's about putting a word in the chat that talks about how we move from what is a single word that moves us from being fixers to participants in wholeness. So I invite people to type words in the chat. And then also, perhaps just to take a piece of paper and a pen and write something, make the intention real. What can we do? What can I do this week that will move me from being a fixer to being a participant in wholeness? Chanel?
And just to also add to what Nasli is asking us all to do, certainly I want you to also think a little bit more about how do we move through that of woundedness together, right? It becomes important if we're looking at the question around societal healing. And when looking at this movement, we're also looking at how transformation, as we spoke about the river, right, and the flow, we start seeing an ecological 4 phases approach that basically pops up. It requires us, for example, to name. So, for example, speaking truth to what has been broken becomes really important. So being completely true to ourselves and saying, this is what's the woundedness, this is what it's looking at, right? It's also important for us to look at how are we witnesses, right? How are we bearing witness? So looking at practices then of listening deeply becomes important. Looking at this theme itself of remembering becomes important because it certainly is an approach to restore then our shared humanity. So looking at us all as active agents of change and of societal change becomes really important. And the last phase for that transformation, certainly as Nasli spoke about, the practice of restoring, right? So looking at how do we begin to look at new and imagined new futures basically together, how transformation intends to look like. So for example, looking at this making it practical, basically. We see in Guatemala, for example, whether it was exhumations that served both justice and healings, right? Whether it's in Senegal, for example, where women took to the streets, organizing different protests up within cities around gender-based violence, or whether it's the US, where Black farmers have been also reclaiming land, right, and dignity. These are different active agents that took healing and societal healing and made it practical in how they envisioned their transformations to look like, right? And most importantly, one of the deepened movements is certainly that of solidarity. So questioning how are we building coalitions, how is healing coming through that of solidarity, right? So very important to note that as the metaphor of the river then becomes important, because each and every river meets other rivers, right? And the most important then is we certainly start to see the streams then of justice and dignity and transformation and filtering through that right there. So Nazli, I'm going to give over to you if you'd like to share any final closing points your end. I'm happy to bounce back as well after that.
Chanel mentioned some big movements, and I'd like to offer a counter to that and say that when we think about societal healing and we think about our individual healing, it's not about grand actions necessarily. It's about it's about small steps. So it can simply be something like the question you choose to ask first. It can be something like listening without offering a solution right away. It could be as simple as acknowledging emotion in a room. It can also just be asking yourself, can I love here? Can I be here? Can I live here? Can I be loved here? And so when we think about healing, it's massive, especially within the world that we live in. But the actions that we take don't have to be massive actions. It's simple, small actions that we can take. And so in taking those small actions, it is about remembering a way forward, not with a giant leap, but with small, mighty shifts of our own. And what might seem small to somebody else could be mighty to you. Again, it's about our personal experiences, our personal histories, and meeting the moment where we are. And so by meeting the moment where we are, that's essentially how we start flowing with the river where we are. And with that, I'd like to just say thank you for listening. And again, it's by no means a complete framework, but it's a living something that we invite everybody to help us make pragmatic. So if there are any questions or comments, concerns, recommendations, we're happy to hear all of it. Thank you so much.
Kathy May has her hand raised.
Kathy
Thank
May.
you. Thank you. Thank you, Matthias. And thank you, Nazli and Chanel, for taking us through this walk through nature along with you. Thank you. I may have lost my question. This is it. Could you please tell us about examples of where this model has been implemented so that we can hear about the practice of healing, which is nature-based and which seeks this rediscovery, I suppose, this surfacing our remembering ourselves as nature. Are there examples you can guide us through, please? Thank you so much.
There are examples where people have used nature as part of remembering themselves. This particular model has not been really been used yet, so we're presenting it here for the first time. I know that one of the people that was in the that was part of the research project is in the room right now. I'm not sure if she'd like to respond. Janet, if you can hear me.
Thanks, Naz.
Sorry.
Yeah, as Nazli was saying, packaged in this way, drawing on these different wisdoms, we haven't yet implemented. That's what our hopes for next year really are. But what's been drawn on is the collective wisdom of particularly people doing rites of passage work. There's some really interesting rites of passage work in the wilderness that's been particularly powerful. Storytelling practice, then using particularly embodied arts practices, and actually then also bringing in the lens of traditional psychology. And so the group that convened to do this research together were drawing on very different modalities, each of them. And so we spoke a little bit about what we were busy trying to discover, being at the center of pulling on indigenous wisdom and deep ecology, the faith traditions, and then traditional psychology, and looking at where we can weave those practices together. But I think for us, the next week, we managed to get a little bit of funding just to do this research. And now the big question is, particularly, how do we, I think there's two ways we're thinking about it. How do we gift this to practitioners as a framework for them to just help aid their design of processes, so that we can shift processes into a more healing methodology? And then the second is, how can we build a network of implementation that really shifts this from the thinking space into the doing space over the next year? But all of, I mean, I guess in one sense, we're not inventing anything new. We're naming existing practices and trying to build a sort of flow of methodology that helps to center healing, even whilst you might be using a range of existing methodologies, that the questions you ask, the intentions that you draw on at different points really frame healing as the point, rather than problem solving as the point.
Sure. Janet,
Janet.
if I may add, just to answer Kathy May's question as well. So just in a different case study. So I wrote my master's in 2020, and I looked at the Castle of Good Hope, right, as one of the colonial sites of historical trauma. And just to answer, how do you tie in the ecology, nature to that of healing, right? And one of the participants within my research, he spoke about bringing in indigenous knowledge systems, as what Janet spoke about. So for example, in Cape Town, we have buchu, we have sage, using the medicinal herbs as a welcoming ceremony to those who have gone before. So for example, looking at the site of historical trauma, such as the Castle of Good Hope, the participant would then welcome in the ancestors of those who went before by reconnecting them to that of indigenous knowledge through that of the herbs, right? Also not only looking at the use of herbs and nature, but also looking at language. Language itself becomes a form of healing. So speaking back languages that were once maybe taken away, right, from the Khoi and San, but bringing that back into practice within sites of memory or within the landscape itself becomes important. Looking also at symbolic justice aims of renaming buildings or renaming especially mountains, for example, with Table Mountain being commonly called Table Mountain, but looking at inserting a Kwekwe Guvap name to it, being Hurikwaho, for example, that also becomes a part and a very symbolic part of restoring both that of memory and remembering, and also looking at inserting that effort of societal healing as a collective move for many. So certainly just to just touch on your question a little bit with just a different case study there. Janet?
Any other questions or?
Oh, there, sorry. I saw a little box around Janet. I don't know if she was talking there, but you're on mute.
No, I don't think Janet's speaking.
Okay, no problem. Are there any other questions?
If I may, what what's the role? I mean, you've spoken a little bit about belonging at a certain point. And have you found loneliness or isolation as a big source of injuries in this society we're living in? Is it something that, because there's a lot of talking nowadays about belonging and isolation, and what paths are there to promote ways of belonging um, that are healing instead of fixing?
Chanel, would you like to offer an explanation?
Yeah, so just to respond, I would say I think one of the very difficult reckoning, right, is especially given today's life, we are very in a very fast-paced kind of world where we don't often look at our own internal woundedness, yet alone collective woundedness. And sometimes when speaking to these conversations, we start to then open our eyes to that woundedness. And I think that in and of itself brings upon that reckoning. And that journey then of looking at how deeply wounded am I becomes part of that broader conversation and of how deeply wounded are we as a society, then also overwhelms then that individual. And that for me brings basis to how that process of isolation can also take place in terms of looking at that reckoning at this moment in time. Right? This might not have happened to me in my today's life, but looking at what happened to the ancestries, right? Of the people that went before, but of the people who I hold within and of the generations that I have to birth, right? It also brings me to that moment of isolation of who am I? Where do I belong? How do I start to reckon these forms of multitude traumas, right? And whose burden is it then to carry then that question of societal healing and what it means today? So hence, it certainly is a moment of where the isolation takes place, but it calls then for that collective moments of truths and collective moments of witnessing that certainly brings back, looking at that collective societal healing as the end goal.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate the time that you took to spend with us. And I hope some of it landed.
Thank you so much, everyone, on my end as well. And before we all go, I just would like to leave us just with a little something, right? And it's more of a challenge as well. So certainly, first things first, our challenge is not only to repair, right? But it is to reimagine. That's important. Key points, right? And also to note that when we heal by not forgetting. So we only begin to heal when we start to remember well. Right? So what we remember, whose history, whose stories becomes important then, and who is the co-creators of this right here becomes important going forward. Thank you so much once again to all.
I have a final question, please, Chanel and Nasli, so
Go
that
for it.
we can please keep you for a little bit longer.
Yes.
I love this work that you are proposing. I've also learned that we have sometimes lost the capacity to dream and imagine. And so that when we propose dreaming and imagine, place, space, rapport, all of these things matter so much. And I wondered whether I hear the embrace of indigeneity. I hear the opening to cosmologies that have long been silenced. But I wondered whether you, and I appreciate you've not yet implemented the model, that it's coming, but I wondered whether anybody on the call has found ways of encouraging, because this is very deep work. It's very deep. It's retreat type work, right? It's not
Yes.
not an afternoon session or a 1 hour session. It's very immersive. It's very immersive work for us to have the comfort and the capacities to be able to be uncomfortable and unsettled. And I wondered whether anyone has any experience of entering these realms of imagining, of recalling, of seeing ancestral work not only in linear terms, but really appreciating that all of these wonderful, the elements and the ancestors to come, that they all run through us. I would so love to hear of other members speaking about this dreaming and imagining, and of course from you people at Tutu Foundation, where we know we get this discipline of hope from, and we lean so much into it. Please, I'm sorry, it's a long question, but I'd be so grateful. Thank you.
I'm just checking to see if there is anybody else in the room who might want to respond. It's a hard question, Kathy May. And I say it's a hard question because we talk about reimagining, and we talk about dreaming and hoping. And hope is hard work, as I've come to understand and learn just by being here. And then I meet young people who come to the exhibition and they've never been to the city before, or they've never been, some of them have never been to the ocean before, and they are surrounded by water. And so when I think about what you're saying, that we perhaps have forgotten how to dream or forgotten, sometimes I don't think it's that we've forgotten. I think quite by design, those things are not always available to us, or haven't been available to a lot of us. And I wonder, and part of what I'm trying to work through you with this model is how do we transition from, we know that this is deep work and we know it needs to be done, and how do you bring, I'm thinking about young people in particular, how do you bring young people into this while still holding their dignity and not make it about them being deficient because they haven't had an opportunity to dream or an opportunity to imagine, let alone reimagine. And so I don't have an answer, but that's something I sit with as well. And what I do invite members in this webinar to think about is help us think about ways to make this tangible and pragmatic. Kathy may have not answered your question, but that's something I'm sitting with.
I so appreciate that. Thank you so much, Nasli. And you were going to come in as well, Chanel.
Yes, Kathy May, and just to give you another case study. So on a previous external project I worked on with women in the West Coast, and I hope that this could give you some hope, answers also to that question. So the women in the West Coast, they had a very difficult time with mining companies coming in and certainly expropriating land. They had very difficult challenges, for example, where patriarchy was present, whereby they would be the owners of the boats, but their husbands would be the controllers and the only ones who would have the permits to the sea. And being that the sea being the only form of income, for example, through that of having the permit to fish, they were certainly being excluded. And one of the ways in which, as mentioned, it was a former project I was on, the way in which we came into the research was on a very co-created style and framework, right? Coming in with not only an aspect for that of research, but certainly looking at what is the capacity building, what is the element of empowerment, and that is certainly not dictated by us. And that is certainly what I envision seeing this research right here also doing, going in and not dictating what capacity building looks like or what empowerment looks like, but certainly allowing them for that to be the co-created space to envision, right? So looking at the practical example yet again with the women from the West Coast, what they then stated was we need to bring this to the attention of the counselor. We need to bring this to the attention of whoever to get us permits, right? And one of the active ways then was certainly writing letters, looking at different ways of empowering different people from different neighborhoods and if not even different cities to state, look, this is a collective issue right here and we're needing our permits. And one of the successful rates then was when the women received the permits, because they were certainly also of an age of where they were being excluded, given that they were 60 years and plus, right, and older. And they stated that this is quite ageist. So looking at yet again, what is the forms of capacity building that is dictated by those who we are going into, while the communities or the groups of people who wants these forms of transformation in their lives. And I think once there is a tangible kinds of outcome, we then certainly start to see how people then started dreaming again. So for example, women who wanted to start certain businesses, or women now that they have their permits, or now that they have the form of empowerment or self-gratification of a process, you know, to be seen, for example, the longing to be seen and voices to be heard, that right there was the power that then certainly sparked you know, the creative imagination of how the world can be. And what was so beautiful, the connection then for me personally was, as an external project, I had the opportunity to, as you know, I work here at the foundation. We managed to get some of those women to the foundation for their external event of where they showcased their own film, their own documentary. And that was a first of many young people also who joined them as well. So you see the generational reimagination of where people who never even thought they'd come this side to the city were, yeah, you know. And it started off yet again by looking at what is the call to capacity building, what's the call to empowerment, and how do you certainly create that co-created space for people then to take it and own it for themselves. I hope that
Thank you, thank you. It's this reawakening to ourselves as world makers, not in isolation, but certainly in as part of many, many multiple dimensions and dynamics. Thank you both so much.
Thank
you for having us.
Matthias,
Are we? Yes. Are we? So, thank you so much for sharing not just the research but also your time and your knowledge and wisdom, both Nasty and Chanel. Thank you everyone for attending and for being part of this session of Voices for Peace. And thank you to the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation also for being a part of this collective project. I hope to see you all in our very next session that's going to be hosted by Soka Kakai International and Amnesty International. And yeah, just thank you once again for your time and being here.